Water is enough for poor people.
Susan said, laughing loudly. I frowned at her lack of manners.
Wait, could it be?
Immediately afterward, Rachel looked at me and turned pale. I couldn't help but let out a small chuckle. My name is Diane. I become 54 this year. I divorced my ex-husband when our daughter, Emily, was 3 years old. The reason for the divorce was a clash of personalities. On top of that, my ex-husband wouldn't work and drank all the time. No matter how many times I told him to change, he never did. Of course, our finances were in dire straits. I decided I didn't need a family like that, so I resolved to divorce him. We divorced on the condition that there would be no child support or alimony. Since then, it's just been Emily and me. Until the divorce, I was a stay-at-home mom. When it was decided that I was to raising Emily on my own, I threw myself into work. I couldn't leave young Emily home alone, so right after the divorce, I got by with various side jobs. Of course, we were living on the edge. Even working from morning till night, my pay was low. So we lived frugally. There were times when, with one day left until payday, I ran out of money and went without food myself. Despite these hardships, I managed to raise Emily until she became an adult. When Emily started working, I found more free time, and now I devote a lot of it to work. I began creating handmade items, using my experience from home-based jobs. This has now become a successful business. And there have been changes in my personal life too. Emily got engaged. After working at her company for a while, Emily started dating a man named James. James is her boss and is 5 years older. Emily showed me a picture of him once, and he seemed like a really nice guy. It looks like Emily learned what not to fall for in a man from her father, and chose a responsible man like James. I'm so happy for the happiness Emily has found. My life is at its midpoint now. From here on, I want to live the way I want. That's what I had been thinking. Then, one day,
Mom, I have something to talk to you about.
Emily approached me after dinner. It's rare for Emily to approach me so hesitantly. Thinking this, I responded to her. What's up? You're acting a bit strange. Then, Emily shyly said,
The truth is, I'm getting married to James.
Really? That's wonderful. Congratulations. I had never actually met James, so I wasn't sure what kind of person he was. I hoped he was as nice as he looked in the photos.
I'm glad to hear you say that, Mom. I was worried you might be against it.
Emily seemed relieved that I didn't object. She had a clearly relaxed expression. Then Emily made a suggestion.
So, this weekend, I'd like you to meet James.
Emily must have wanted me to meet James before the wedding. I know how serious Emily is about things. She probably wanted to introduce her fiancé, James, to me to reassure me. I nodded firmly to Emily. All right, I'll meet James. I want to know what kind of person he is.
Mom,
Emily said, looking happy. And so it was decided that I would meet James. Sunday of that weekend, I waited for Emily and James at home. It was just before 11 a.m. They would be arriving soon. Just then, the doorbell rang.
Yes.
When I opened the door, there stood Emily and James.
Nice to meet you. I'm James, and I'm engaged to Emily. It's a pleasure to meet you.
James greeted me politely. I felt a bit relieved by his good manners. Emily is my precious only daughter. I was glad that her partner seemed to be a decent person. Nice to meet you too. Come on in. I invited Emily and James into the house. Even after entering the house, James seemed like a nice young man. He brought a gift of well-known brand name cookies, the kind sold in department stores. He also happily talked about how he met Emily.
James, stop it. You're embarrassing me.
Emily said, looking shy. Seeing Emily like that was very new to me. However, the cheerful atmosphere suddenly changed in the next moment.
By the way, is your husband at work today?
James asked, looking around curiously. His face showed a hint of confusion. I was taken aback by his question. When I glanced at Emily, she looked a bit pale. She must have kept the fact that we're a single-parent family from him. Honestly, Emily was at fault for not telling him. In more traditional families, there's often a prejudice against single-parent households. I steeled myself and explained the situation to James. Emily might not have told you, but actually, I'm divorced.
It's just the two of us.
James's smile disappeared for a moment, replaced by a blank expression. What's wrong? I asked James, feeling uneasy. Maybe it was a mistake for me to tell him.
That's what I thought.
But the next moment, James was already smiling again.
Nothing at all. Don't worry about it.
He said with a grin.
I see.
I replied, tilting my head in confusion. Despite being puzzled by James's change in expression, I couldn't bring myself to ask anything more. After that, the wedding plans moved along smoothly. Emily seemed to enjoy preparing for the wedding.
What kind of dress should I wear for the reception? Mom, what color dress do you think would be good?
She asked excitedly. Well, how about a color you like, Emily? I replied, though my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't forget James's expression from that day. The way his face went blank. Maybe his family is strict about single-parent households. So I asked Emily, what did James say after that day about us being a single-parent family? Maybe James's family opposed his marriage to Emily. When I asked, Emily answered, like I was asking an odd question.
He didn't say anything special. Mom, you're worrying too much.
Since Emily said that, I couldn't ask any more. But my bad feeling turned out to be right. One night,
Mom,
Emily called my name as soon as she came home. She was visibly upset, and I asked her in surprise, Emily, why do you look so down? Did something happen? Even though I asked, Emily remained silent. It was unusual for optimistic Emily to look so troubled. After a while, Emily spoke, looking like it was hard for her to say.
The truth is, James's family doesn't approve of our marriage.
She said this with a sad expression. Why not?
Because we're a single-parent family. They think James will have a hard time because we're poor.
That was an incredibly harsh statement. It must have been really tough for Emily to hear that from his family. I asked Emily seriously, did James' mom say that? Emily nodded silently. I was furious at such an occurrence. I didn't want them to assume we were poor just because we were a single-parent family. We had struggled, but now we were living a normal life. In fact, I worked as hard as any man. Then Emily said something even more unbelievable.
James' sister also said some things.
What things? I asked Emily.
She said, "You and your mom just plan to mooch off James, don't you? There's no way I'm letting my brother marry people like that."
Emily answered, looking dejected.
She had a solitary look.
She must have been deeply hurt, being struck by their brutal honesty face to face. I couldn't believe they would say such terrible things even about me, someone they hadn't met yet. James' family was truly unbelievable. What did James say at that moment? I asked Emily. Then I remembered James' face when he came to our house the other day. His blank expression at that moment might have been because he was anticipating his family's reaction. It seemed his family had quite a prejudice against single-parent families. I began to worry about the future. Then Emily said,
James defended me. He said, "Emily works at the same company as me, so there's no way she's after my money."
I felt relieved.
"It's good to know James is on your side, Emily." I found myself muttering. If James didn't defend Emily and sided with his family, I'd be worried about her future. She would likely face continuous harsh remarks from them. But knowing James was on her side made things a bit better.
A few days later,
Emily suggested a meeting between both families.
"Mom, before the wedding, I'd like you to meet James' family. I'm really sorry."
According to Emily, it was James's mother, Susan, who suggested it.
She said, "Your mother should at least greet our family. Surely your mother has that much common sense."
Emily said she and James couldn't refuse.
"I'm really sorry, Mom."
Emily apologized, concerned about me. To support Emily's wedding, I had to meet them. Honestly, I didn't know what they might say. I didn't want to go, but I knew I had to be polite.
all right, I agreed.
And so the day of the meeting arrived. I went with Emily to a restaurant near their house. Emily said Susan insisted on a restaurant because
"We can't have you over until you're officially part of the family. There's a high-end restaurant nearby, so that'll do."
the restaurant Susan chose cost about $300 per person. I occasionally went there for business, but never privately. I was puzzled by her choice of venue. When Emily first met them, Susan had chosen a nearby cafe. And Emily ended up paying for her coffee too.
"You're going to be part of the family, so it's only natural."
James eventually reimbursed Emily for the coffee, but still. Why was Susan acting so superior, even though she was the one who requested the meeting? I frowned at the thought. However, if I, as Emily's mother, refused, Emily would be criticized as being rude. After the wedding, Emily might be treated poorly. I couldn't let that happen, so I reluctantly accepted the proposal. So I put on light makeup and headed to the agreed location. In my usual work, I wear full makeup, but I thought it best to keep it modest today. I also chose a much plainer outfit than usual. If I dressed too flashy, they might think I was extravagant with money. Considering they accused me of being after James' money, a humble appearance seemed like the best strategy. With that in mind, Emily and I entered the high-end restaurant, where a staff member escorted us to a private room. When we opened the door, James and his family were already there.
Emily, Diane, thank you for coming today.
James said politely, "Thank you for having us."
I replied,
Then I turned to face his parents, Susan and John, and his sister, Rachel. Susan, John, and Rachel looked at Emily and me with condescending smiles. It was clear from the start that we were not welcome. I heightened my sense of caution as I greeted them. "Thank you for taking the time to meet us today. I'm Diane, Emily's mother. Nice to meet you." Susan laughed derisively and said,
I'm not particularly pleased to meet you.
Mom,
James admonished her, but Susan was unfazed.
That you are from a single parent family by itself is a problem. You must have struggled with money. And look at how plain your clothes are.
This is what Susan said as she stared at my outfit from top to bottom. Then she snorted in disdain. It seemed that my deliberate choice to dress modestly had backfired. Rachel laughed and added,
James could have married someone better. He drew the short straw, taking in a poor mother and daughter.
I was irritated by Rachel's comment. Such rudeness at our first meeting was beyond insulting. But I couldn't jeopardize Emily's wedding. "Excuse me," I said reluctantly and took my seat. Because I didn't respond, they looked at me with amused expressions. Emily watched me with concern. James seemed a bit angry with his family's rudeness. A frown was forming on his forehead. Susan, oblivious to this, was in high spirits.
We've reserved the course meal today. It's $300 per person.
Susan said happily to Rachel.
Really? The course meals here are so expensive. I can't wait to eat.
Rachel said excitedly.
John nodded happily as well. After a while, the staff started bringing out the dishes. A variety of colorful amuse-bouches. At this restaurant, they serve 3 kinds of amuse-bouches on one plate. They all looked delicious. But in front of me, there was only a glass of water.
"What?"
I tried to call the staff back, but they had already left. Only the glass of water remained in front of me. James looked stunned at the sight. Rachel, seemingly aware of the situation, laughed quietly.
"Mom."
Emily noticed and called to me anxiously. Then Susan smirked.
Water is enough for poor people.
She said, laughing loudly. I frowned at her lack of manners. What is the meaning of this? I asked Susan. They had called us to this restaurant, yet had no intention of treating us well. I was inwardly quite irritated. Susan glanced at me and smiled with satisfaction. She didn't seem to care that I was angry. In fact, she seemed to be enjoying it.
Oh my, not only are you poor and from a single parent family, but you're also stupid. There's no way we'd welcome someone like you.
Susan sneered at me. John nodded in agreement.
Don't you feel ashamed of being from a single parent family? A woman abandoned by her husband is just embarrassing and disgraceful. No wonder a plain woman like you is unwanted by anyone.
John laughed loudly. John had made such baseless assumptions when I wasn't even abandoned by my ex-husband. It was truly unbelievable. Rachel laughed as well, saying,
I don't want to end up like Emily's mom. Working low-wage jobs all the time, giving up on being a woman. It's really pathetic.
She looked down on me as she spoke.
Mom, I'm sorry.
Emily looked like she was about to cry. She probably felt responsible for the situation. Emily hung her head. I had reached my limit. Being looked down on this much, I couldn't stay quiet any longer. It was time to fight back. At that moment,
Enough is enough. How can you all gang up and insult Emily and Diane like this? Aren't you ashamed as adults?
James shouted loudly. I was surprised that James stood up for us.
James.
Emily was also shocked. James, his face red with anger, was furious at his family. However, Susan and the others showed no signs of remorse.
There's no need to defend poor people. Why are you so angry, James?
Susan said, still laughing. John nodded in agreement. It seemed James's words had no effect on them. Susan and John were truly exasperating. They clearly had no sense of common decency. Maybe it was time to strike back. I had a special card to play that could really shut them up. Just then, Rachel began staring intently at me. I couldn't help but glare at Rachel. And she muttered.
Wait a minute. Could it be?
A moment later, Rachel's face turned pale as she looked at me. It seemed she had finally realized who I was. I allowed myself a small smile. Rachel started trembling.
No way.
John noticed Rachel's reaction and asked, looking puzzled.
What's wrong with you? You've been acting weird.
Susan, too, was surprised by Rachel's reaction.
Goodness, your face is pale. Are you feeling all right?
She asked with apparent concern. But Rachel's trembling didn't stop. Considering what she had realized, it was understandable. Then Rachel quietly asked John,
Dad. You work at Smith Handicrafts, right?
Rachel looked intently at John, as if trying to confirm the truth. Smith Handicrafts is a small company with about 100 employees. The salaries there are much lower compared to larger companies. And I knew Smith Handicrafts. Why? Because it was a company connected to my work. John laughed and said,
Why do you ask all of a sudden? Believe it or not, I'm the sales director there.
John continued,
And thanks to my connections, I got you a part-time job at our company. You should be grateful.
He laughed loudly.
I knew it.
Rachel said, looking defeated and disheartened. John, puzzled, asked Rachel,
But why are you asking about that? Is it to brag about being a full-time employee compared to this poor woman who's just a part-timer?
He looked at me with a condescending gaze. I vowed to myself that I would bring this man to his knees. I made a promise in my heart. Rachel sighed lightly and began to explain.
Dad, don't you know who our company's clients are?
Clients?
John asked, still puzzled. Susan also looked blankly. As a stay-at-home mom, she seemed to have little understanding of business matters. Rachel hesitated, then explained.
I've met Diane before, at the company. She wore heavier makeup then, so I didn't recognize her immediately.
John appeared confused.
What do you mean at the company? I remember all our employees, even the part-timers, and there's no way this old woman works there.
I frowned at his slip of calling me an old woman. But John was too preoccupied to notice. He was desperately trying to recall his memories upon hearing it was at the company. However, I had never spoken directly with John, so it was understandable that he didn't remember me. As I was thinking this, Rachel began to apologize.
Diane, I'm really sorry for everything.
Seeing Rachel's demeanor, Susan and John began to get nervous.
Why are you apologizing? There's no need to apologize to someone like her.
Susan said, trying to stop Rachel.
That's right. Don't you have any pride apologizing to this poor woman?
John yelled at Rachel. Rachel glared at Susan and John.
Dad, Mom, Diane is actually very wealthy. Far more than you.
What?
John glared at Rachel. He probably never expected to hear such a thing from his own daughter. How can you say that? Susan shouted hysterically. Rachel responded in a resigned tone.
Because Diane is a CEO. I've served her tea in our company's meeting room. You know Johnson Bags, right?
John froze upon hearing the name. Then he slowly turned his head to look at me. I couldn't help but smile. John's face turned pale.
Johnson Bags. That's the brand our CEO finally secured a collaboration with.
Susan screamed.
Johnson Bags. They have stores in department stores. My bag is from them too.
She looked repeatedly at her own bag. When we entered the restaurant, I had noticed the familiar bag. Susan had been holding it carefully under her chair. Though it was against etiquette in a high-end restaurant, it was clearly her favorite bag. I chuckled and said to Susan, "That's a freebie from a magazine, isn't it? I'm honored you're using my brand." Susan's face turned bright red, and she looked down in embarrassment. She must have felt ashamed that her bag was just a magazine freebie. I swiftly pulled out my business card from its holder. "I'm Diane Johnson, the CEO of Johnson Bags." Susan and John stared intently at the card.
You're really the CEO.
John trembled as he looked at the card. Susan also looked incredulous. I spoke to them as they silently stared at my card. We were planning a collaboration with Smith Handicrafts, but it seems that's no longer possible.
What a pity.
Hearing this, John's face turned pale.
Why? That's the project our CEO is most excited about. If we cancel that collaboration, our company will.
John said, shaking with fear.
What's going on?
Susan asked, clearly confused. The truth is, Smith Handicrafts is in a precarious financial situation. Compared to how things were in the past, fewer people are making handmade items. When I was young, my mother hand-sewed everything. But now, cheap ready-made products are widespread, a sign of the times. Smith Handicrafts has been severely affected by this trend, with sales declining every year. When the CEO of Smith Handicrafts proposed the collaboration, he mentioned that it was a last-ditch effort to save the company. However, I collaborate with many famous brands. So, I honestly wasn't very interested in collaborating with a small company like Smith Handicrafts. So, at first, I declined the CEO's proposal, but ultimately, his passion convinced me to agree. We decided to collaborate and create a line of bags together. However, that's all in the past now. John was trembling violently. He was surely terrified of what was to come. Ignoring him, I spoke calmly. Collaborating with Smith Handicrafts doesn't offer much benefit. I only agreed because of the CEO's passion. But a company that has employees who look down on Emily. I fixed John with a cold stare. Under my gaze, John broke out in a cold sweat. In the next moment, he began to apologize desperately.
What?
Susan was bewildered by John's apology, but he continued to beg for my forgiveness. Emily and James were also stunned by John's sudden change in demeanor.
I'm really sorry.
John desperately apologized. He looked completely desperate. To me, John's apology meant nothing. An apology made only after realizing my position was just an attempt to protect himself. There was no genuine remorse in it. I spoke in a harsh, cold voice. Now you apologize after all the disdain you've shown towards Emily and me? To think he believes that after all this, an apology would be enough. John's head is truly in the clouds. And John, realizing that an apology wouldn't improve the situation, quickly stood up. It was all just a performance. Susan, looking puzzled, turned to me and said,
We're going to be family, so you can forgive us, right?
She looked at me with a fake smile. Then Susan continued,
I'm a huge fan of Johnson bags. As family, I'd get products for free, right?
She looked at me expectantly. I was too stunned to speak.
Mom, how could you ask for such things?
James said, his face grim. Susan's statement was incredibly inappropriate.
Why not? Surely you have plenty of stock. It wouldn't hurt to give us a few.
Susan said, clearly annoyed. John and Rachel looked exasperated by her attitude. I looked at Susan and said, We don't give our products away for free. Besides, you're not family. Susan looked frustrated at my response.
But Emily is marrying James. That makes us family. And as family, you should support us financially. You're a CO after all.
Susan said, unfazed. After all the disdain she had shown, she still had this attitude. She clearly felt no remorse. Finally, James snapped.
Mom, aren't you ashamed to switch up your attitude just like that only after you found out Diane is a CO?
James, his face red with anger, reprimanded Susan. However, Susan just laughed it off, seeming unconcerned.
What's the big deal? COs have more money than they need. She could share a little with us.
I calmly told Susan. Even if Emily and James get married, I have no intention of having any ties with you. Susan looked shocked and tried to approach me.
Don't say that. Once Emily and James are married, we'll be family, so you can give us a bag or two.
Susan's attitude truly infuriated me. As I was thinking of how to respond, James stepped between us. James, I said, questioning him, and he looked troubled.
I knew Diane was a CO, and I kept it a secret because I knew my parents would bother her if they found out.
James confessed, making John look frustrated.
You knew? If you had told me, I would have.
Yeah, you would have been sucking up to her, just like Mom.
James replied, looking at John coldly.
How dare you speak to your parents like that? I'll disown you.
John shouted at James. Emily looked distressed by the argument. James sighed and said,
Fine, disown me. I'm cutting ties with you.
Why would you say that? We raised you with so much effort.
Susan said, sounding agitated. John and Rachel stared at James in shock. They probably never expected him to say something like that.
I want to cherish Emily from now on. I don't need a family that disrespects her and Diane.
Susan collapsed in tears. John and Rachel were also stunned. Being disowned by the son they had doted on must have been hard for them. But it was their own doing. Regret this for the rest of your lives. You're in for a tough time, I said with a smirk. Emily added.
Even if we have children, you won't hear about them.
She spoke firmly to Susan and John.
Not seeing our grandchildren. Please, anything but that.
Susan cried out in despair. In the midst of this, James said quietly.
Our family is over.
Those words seemed to hit John and Rachel hard as they looked at us, almost in tears. Ignoring them, I left the restaurant with Emily and James. After that, I heard that John and Rachel were fired from the company. The day after the incident at the restaurant, I told the CEO of Smith Handicrafts that I wanted to cancel the collaboration. Despite the CEO's repeated attempts to persuade me, I refused. I can't collaborate with a company that has employees who treat people so poorly. While I sympathized with the CEO's desire to turn his company around, I couldn't support a company where John and Rachel worked. I explained the situation to the CEO.
He was furious.
It turned out the CEO had a daughter around Emily's age, and he couldn't tolerate John and Rachel's behavior. The collaboration with my company was crucial for Smith Handicrafts. John and Rachel had ruined that opportunity. Given the circumstances, it was understandable that the CEO couldn't forgive them. John was already getting on in years, and Rachel was only working part-time thanks to John's connections. Now that they were fired from Smith Handicrafts, finding new jobs would be incredibly difficult for both of them. Susan was a stay-at-home mom. And now, cut off from James, their only source of income was gone. Once, Susan and John came to my company to plead their case.
Please collaborate with Smith Handicrafts. If you do, the CEO might rehire me.
Even if the collaboration isn't possible, please provide financial support. We're family after all. Families help each other in tough times.
Both of them begged desperately. After calling me a poor person, now they had the audacity to claim we were family.
It was laughable.
I firmly told them. Collaboration and financial support are out of the question. James has cut ties with you as well. Please leave immediately. However, Susan and John refused to leave. They continued to plead, trying to cling to me. I firmly told Susan and John once more, never appear before me again. If I see you again, I will call the police. Perhaps it was the mention of the police, but John finally stopped begging.
Please, not the police. We won't come back again.
John said as he led Susan away. Their clothes were worn and dirty, and it was clear they weren't living well. After all, these were the people who had called me poor. It was their own fault. I heard that Rachel had become a complete recluse. She couldn't find a job and wasn't able to get married. In despair about her future, she refused to leave her room. Rachel's future seemed utterly bleak. 3 years have passed since then. Now, I live with Emily and James. Ideally, as newlyweds, they should be living on their own. However, James insisted.
I think it's reassuring for Emily to be with you, Diane, in case of emergencies.
So they moved in with me. James often helps with the housework, especially when I'm busy with work. I'm truly grateful. Our family has experienced a big change recently. One day, Emily approached me with a serious look on her face.
Mom,
I worried that something had happened to her. Then, Emily smiled and said,
I think I'm going to be a mom.
She gently stroked her belly, looking happy. That's wonderful news, Emily. Congratulations. I hugged her with joy. James, standing beside us, was also smiling happily. We'll face many challenges in the future, but I'm confident we'll overcome them together. I'm looking forward to meeting my new grandchild. Thinking about our happy future, I couldn't help but smile.